Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 3. Angela woke early to a bright, clear dawn. Somewhere outside a cock was crowing, but there was no other sound. The noisy visitors of the previous night had either gone or were still asleep. She was stiff and aching from the previous 2 days of travel, and she longed for a hot bath. But that, of course, was out of the question. She was still wearing most of her clothes, and she had used her coat to cover her. Remembering Clive's injunction about a skirt, she had got up and changed her trousers for one of those which she had worn in the village. It was full of dark, patterned material, and was both long and full. Over it she put on the tunic blouse with wide sleeves, which she had worn with the trousers, but not her coat, which was too thick and heavy for her present milder environment. She brushed and replaited her hair and wound the shawl that Clive had produced about her head and face. It was of black silk and similar to those of coarser material which the village women wore. She wondered if he had brought it for the purpose of disguising her, a modest Moslem wife. If that meant covering everything up, she looked the part, but how far from the truth. If only she were in reality Clive's wife, the future would hold no terrors for her, but once they had arrived in Kabul, she would have to fend for herself, and she felt quite incapable of doing so. There was no sign of Clive when she opened her door, and she felt a pang of contrition as she looked down at the bare boards. How uncomfortable he must have been during the night, and he could have found better accommodation downstairs. But he had stayed beside her door like a faithful watchdog, so that no one could disturb her without waking him. A warm rush of gratitude welled up in her. How could she ever repay him for his care of her? She climbed down the rickety stair and found to her relief that the room below was empty, and the door ajar. A shaft of gold from the new risen sun spilled through it on the dusty floor. Hoping to find a well or a pump where she could at least wash her face and hands, Angela went outside. Here for a moment she forgot her discomfort as she gazed at the awe-inspiring scene. Mountains on either hand rose in majestic grandeur. Those on the trail they had come down the day before, receding further and further back to ranges of still higher peaks until they became lost in cloud. She did not see a well, but her quick ears caught the sound of running water. She ran recklessly in its direction until she came upon a mountain torrent, swollen by melting snow and foaming over the boulders in its path. She walked beside it, looking for an accessible place where she could reach it, and eventually came upon a flat ledge of rock overhanging a limpid pool. Kneeling down, she stripped off veil and blouse, careless of unseen watchers, and laved her arms and neck in the icy water. Excuse me. Fuck off. Oh, for the love of God. Sorry. Fuck was it? It was refreshing and invigorating. Feeling much better, she dried herself with the shawl and resumed her blouse. Letting the shawl float behind her on the breeze, she made her way back, hoping it would soon dry. She had come further than she had thought, and before she could reach the inn, she was met by a scowling Clive coming towards her. "Where the devil have you been?" he demanded. "I was half out of my mind wondering where you could have got to." "I only went to find a place where I could perform my toilet," she said meekly, "and you seem to have disappeared. Were you afraid one of your villainous-looking cronies had abducted me? I wouldn't put it past them." "Nor would I," he returned. "You look quite appetizing in spite of those ill-fitting clothes." "Thank you, kind sir. My ego needs a boost. I feel as if I'd come out of a rag bag. But where have you been?" "Disposing of the mules. We shan't need them any more, and I made a profit on them." "Do buses really come up here?" she asked, looking at the rough road. "Oh, yes, they manage even worse terrains than this, but their timetable is a bit erratic. Meanwhile, the boy is taking breakfast up to our room, so you'd better come and have it. And put that thing back round your face." "Why? There's no one about, and it's damp." "Do as I say. You're probably being watched from behind every crag." "Does it matter?" "Yes. And while you're with me, you'll obey me." He looked so menacing that she dared not argue further, but put the shawl over her head, leaving her face uncovered. He stepped up to her, gathered the two ends in each hand, and drew it over her mouth and chin, knotting it behind her head. Contumacious, he growled. What is that word? Contumacious! Effectively gagged, she gave him a defiant look out of narrowed dark eyes, and with a short laugh, he took her by the arm and propelled her towards the inn. You don't know what's good for you, he told her, but I do. She had to admit he had a point, for when they reached the tea house, a camel train had just arrived, and Angela had to run the gauntlet of insolent dark eyes as Clive bundled her back inside and up to their stuffy little room. The glamour of being an Eastern Houri... The glamour of being an Eastern Houri is much exaggerated, she said as she pulled off her drapery. You nearly suffocated me. Never mind, I'll make it up to you when we reach Kabul, he told her kindly. But I don't want you to arouse any interest at this stage. You've neither a travel permit nor a passport, and we may just get by preserving the wifely fiction. I'm sorry, she was contrite. Then with a flash of spirit, if you were really my husband, I wouldn't let you bully me. Nor would I let you defy me, he returned. But since I'm not... He shrugged his shoulders. Let's have breakfast. There was only bread and raisins to eat with the ubiquitous tea. Clive said it was a pity it was too early for melons. Which were a great feature of Afghan diet. They boasted that they grew the finest melons and grapes in the world. Since the camel drivers were occupying the tea house, Clive would not permit her to go out again, and she had to remain in the bathroom until the bus arrived, while he mingled with the men downstairs, drinking tea with them and swapping adventure stories. Angela fumed alone upstairs and reflected that she was gaining a very good idea of what it was like to be in Purdah, and emancipation was spreading far too slowly. Clive might at least have kept her company, but perhaps he was punishing for her for going out without permission in the early morning. A nasty, vengeful character, Clive Stratton, and she was thankful she was not really his wife. But she was deceiving herself. She might try to whip up indignation against him, but in her heart of hearts, she would have been thankful to be Mrs. Clive Stratton. Eventually the bus came. It was an unwieldy-looking vehicle, painted a bright blue with flower patterns in its panels. The driver also had a bunch of flowers in his cab. Afghans loved flowers, and it was not unusual to see a fierce-looking Pushtun with a rose behind his ear, or carried carefully in his fingers. The bus was divided into 3 portions. First class next to the driver, the centre divided by partitions was for ladies, and the rear section was for men. Angela, to her great disgust, was confined in the ladies only, while Clive sat with the driver. Their baggage was piled on the roof. Angela had only one companion, a countrywoman shrouded in a chadri. Remembering what Clive had said, and suspecting the dimly seen eyes were contemptuous, Angela felt almost naked, as she sat opposite to her on the narrow seat. At home, the woman would have gone unveiled, for such drapery would hinder her work in the fields. But when she went to town, she defied the new emancipation by wearing it. Idiot, Angela thought scornfully, pulling her shawl closer around her face. She doesn't know what's good for her. And remembered Clive had told her the same thing. But were Eastern women so foolish? Weren't they seeking to preserve an air of mystery which Western women had entirely lost? Conversation being impossible, Angela smiled ingratiatingly at her companion, hoping to lessen her antagonism. This proved to be entirely illusionary, for the woman produced from under her copious drapery a bag containing a sticky sort of nougat, which she offered to Angela. Sensing a refusal would be hurtful, Angela accepted doubtfully and bravely ate it, nodding her thanks. A further irritation was that the glass in the bus windows was tinted blue, thus obscuring the view of the passing countryside, which still seemed to be mountains, though the road was rapidly losing height. The veiled woman snored gently, and Angela realized she was asleep. Finally, despite the jolting, and because she had passed a bad night, Angela also dozed. It seemed an interminable journey. At noon the bus stopped, and peering out, Angela saw the more devout of the passengers had descended into the roadway to say their prayers. Her companion made no move, though she turned slightly in her seat and bowed her head. Later they stopped for refreshment at what appeared to be a small town, and which was apparently the woman's destination. She was joined by a turbaned ruffian from the back of the vehicle, and Angela was surprised by the tender smile with which he greeted his wife. They walked away, the woman keeping the prescribed pace behind her husband. Angela lost no time in getting out herself. She found the air was much milder than higher in the mountains, and the fields on either side of the road were covered with scarlet tulips, a small variety with pointed... a small variety with pointed petals. "You should have stayed on the bus," Clive said as he joined her. "Oh, but I must stretch my legs," she protested, "and it's high time emancipation was extended to public vehicles." "Country places are always reactionary," he remarked. "But don't British Rail have ladies-only compartments?" "If they still do, I never travel in them." "How do you know?" She flushed and stammered. She did not know, nor could she recall anything about the facilities of British Rail. But presumably she must have travelled upon trains, if she lived in Britain. She did not even know that. "Never mind. Come and eat," Clive bade her. They sat together by the roadside, eating bread and goat's cheese washed down with coffee, for Clive had replenished his thermos at the caravanserai. The blue of the sky was becoming overcast, and a fine rain was falling as they hastily sought the shelter of the bus. The vehicle proceeded on its way, but now several women had invaded Angela's compartment, one with a baby, which she had proceeded to nurse. Angela conceded then that segregation did have its advantages. Before and after sunset, the bus again halted for what Angela designated as the prayer meeting. In spite of the drizzling rain, the devout ones clambered out to kneel on the mats they carried with them. Then darkness fell, and for what seemed like interminable hours, Angela dozed and woke and dozed again as the bus bumped and rocked on its downward journey. She felt she had been travelling thus forever. At long last they rattled into Kabul. "You'll have forgotten what civilization is like," Clive remarked as they changed into a gari, one of the one-horse carriages that still plied for hire in the city streets in competition with the taxis. She said soberly, "That's one of the things I've got to remember, if I can." He had spoken without thinking, but what he had said was only too true. She had forgotten. As they drove to the hotel, Angela peered out eagerly at the city, wondering if it would seem familiar. The streets were asphalt, and there seemed to be roads lined with mud-brick villas among trees, rows of dusty shops, conglomerations of buses, garis, and cotton donkeys, beg your pardon. Then they came to a modern avenue lit by lamps, where there were 4-storey government buildings and the new hotel. Angela sighed. Everything looked new and strange. At the Hotel Kabul, the best in the town, Clive dismissed the gari. Laden with their cumbersome baggage, he signed to Angela to follow him into the foyer. This was vast and furnished with a wealth of Italian furniture. Fluorescent lamps poured a flood of light down upon an inch-thick carpet and rows of vacant chairs. There were several people standing about who looked like European tourists. They stared curiously at the big, golden-haired man, golden-bearded man, who looked as though he had tramped in from the back of beyond, as indeed he had. Angela, following timidly in his wake, felt acutely conscious of her clumsy clothing and boots, which was so out of place among so much grandeur. Clive stalked imperturbably up to the long reception desk, where a clerk in an impeccable European suit was presiding, and dumped his luggage at its foot. Some sort of argument seemed to ensue as he handed over his passport, and Angela remembered uneasily that she did not possess one, which she supposed was an offence. But Clive would find a way round it, she thought confidently. He could think up a solution for every difficulty. Apparently he had done so, for the desk clerk was smiling amicably after a bundle of Afghani notes had changed hands. A porter in a white tunic appeared and picked up their bundles, and Clive turned to her with an odd smile. Drawing a little to one side, he told her in a low voice, "I'm afraid we'll have to continue with the masquerade a little longer. I've only been able to get you in here by declaring you're my wife, and so new that your name hasn't yet been added to my passport. I've registered you as Mrs. Stratton. I don't know if our friend believed me." He nodded towards the clerk, who was watching them with a knowing eye. but I promised that tomorrow we were going to the police, as of course we shall, to straighten out your position. But meanwhile," he gave her a quizzical glance, "we've been given a double room." "We'll manage somehow," she said, ignoring the implication behind his words. After all, they had shared restricted accommodation before, and she trusted Clive entirely, but her heart sank for another reason. Would she be able to establish her identity on the morrow? And if she could not, what was to become of her? She could not continue to trade upon Clive's generosity, borrowing even his name, Mrs. Stratton. Angela Stratton. And she had no claim to either. She was Miss Nobody from nowhere until the block in her memory was removed. Another white-coated porter was waiting to conduct them to their room, and as soon as they reached it, a third appeared, carrying tea in a big flower-patterned teapot, which he put on a table in front of the window, and he bowed and with an obsequious smirk retired. "Isn't it terribly expensive?" Angela asked, overawed by all this service in the big, well-furnished room. "I can afford it," Clive told her, laughing at her anxious expression. "I haven't had any chance to spend money this winter, and after that trek I think we deserve a little luxury." The room promised to supply that. Twin beds were inconspicuous at one end of it, with bedside lamps beside them. There were built-in wardrobes and modern dressers. 2 armchairs were set in the windows on either side of the table, and a chaise longue stood against one wall. The floor was covered with fitted thick piled carpet, and there was a profusion of cushions. "Who stays here?" she inquired, thinking the hotel was out of keeping with Afghanistan's alleged poverty. "Tourists and oil sheikhs, I imagine." Clive was pouring out the tea. While she drank it, Angela continued to study her surroundings. She knew that she had been in a similar room before. Hitherto her environment had been completely novel, with nothing to touch a chord of memory. Even the town had seemed strange, but this was familiar, though on a grand scale. Hotel bedrooms bear a certain similarity the world over, but where had she stayed in one, and with whom? While she pondered, Clive, having finished his tea, was investigating the bathroom. She heard the sound of running water. Standing in the open door of it, he told her, "The water is actually hot, and I'm running a bath for you. You'll find it a great improvement on that stream this morning." "But you?" He gave her a mock bow. "Ladies first." She needed no further invitation, but seizing her bag, scurried into the bathroom. White enamel and shining chromium fittings were also familiar, but she wasted no time in cogitation. Stripping off her clothes, she stepped into the steaming water and enjoyed the first real bath in months. There were large Turkish towels provided, and wrapped in one of them, after completing her ablutions, she surveyed her peculiar assortment of clothing provided by Aziza with distaste, wishing she had something fresh to put on. Sighing, she resumed the coarse chemise and petticoat, her skirt and blouse, and walking barefoot, she had no slippers or shoes, carried her boots and bag and back into the bedroom. "It's all yours, Clive." While he in his turn bathed, she sat down on the chaise longue and undid the plaits which she had tied up on top of her head, brushing out the long silky strands. It fell about her like a shining ebony cloak. Clive came out of the bathroom, arrayed in an embroidered shirt and baggy pants, also a pair of Arabian slippers he had carried in his baggage. His beard and hair sparkled with moisture. He stood looking at the slight girlish figure on the chaise longue, swathed in her long tresses, and looking up, Angela caught a glint in his grey eyes, and for a long moment their gaze locked. She felt her pulse begin to race, and her colour rose under that intent regard. Clive was seeing her as a woman, and possibly a desirable one. But all he said was, "Your hair's grown quite a lot since you were ill." "It has, hasn't it?" She tried to speak casually. He turned away. "Put it up, child. It's too, distracting for our present situation." Disappointed, she began to plait it. But what had she expected? A declaration of some sort? A display of emotion? Clive had himself too well in hand to do either, even if he were attracted, and she dared hardly hope he was. "We look a nice pair of ragamuffins amidst all this grandeur," she observed. "We can't go down to dinner looking as we do." Dinner? That was what one ate at a hotel. Again, memory had stirred. "I'll have some food brought up to us," he said absently. I'll have some food I'll have some food brought up to us, he said absently, and moving to the dressing table began to brush his yellow mane. This'll have to be cut tomorrow. I look like a hippie. Surely there aren't any in Afghanistan, she spoke at random, her feminine intuition aware of an undercurrent. They come in through shoals on their way to India and batten on the native hospitality. We don't want to be mistaken for dropouts. Though he had his back to her, she suspected he was watching her in the mirror. She finished her second braid and, glancing up under her eyelashes, inquired, "What can we do about it?" "What? Oh, yes." He took a grip upon himself and turned from the mirror with a businesslike air. "We'll have to get you something to wear before we present ourselves to the police. What's your size?" She told him, and stared at him in surprise. I remembered." "Sure you did. But perhaps you've grown a bit. We'll make sure." With the aid of a ruler and a piece of string, neither carried a tape measure, he made her measure her hips, waist, and bust, carefully noting the inches on a piece of the hotel writing paper. "But I can't go into a shop and try something on." "But can't I go into a shop and try something on?" she asked. "You're not going outside in daylight until you're properly dressed. I'll have something sent in." She cried distressfully, "However am I going to repay you for everything?" "Now, don't start worrying about that," he said firmly. "You've quite enough on your plate without considering finance. We'll probably find you've got means of your own once you've established your identity." "If I have, I'll repay you every penny," she declared earnestly. "But money can't repay all your care for me. I'll be eternally in your debt." "What a burden for a poor waif to bear," he said mockingly. Perhaps I can suggest a way to suggest a way to ease it." Again there was a gleam in his eyes. And she stared back at him wonderingly. Could he possibly mean? He turned away abruptly. "I too need a change of gear. I left some clothes here to be collected upon my return, but I'll not bother to get them tonight." He yawned. "I'm too damn tired." Angela glanced towards the twin beds. "I hope—" she began, and stopped. She was remembering how last night he had slept, or tried to do so, outside her door. Would he feel it was necessary to do that again? But he could not sleep in the hotel corridor. "We have a good night," he finished for her. "I'm sure we shall." He threw her an enigmatical glance. Enigmatical. A meal was brought up to them by a slit-eyed waiter who glanced at Angela surreptitiously, evidently wondering what the fine bearded sahib could find desirous in such a skinny wife. After it had been removed, Clive yawned again and stretched. "Shall we waive the proprieties and sample those beds?" he asked. "Or will that offend your maiden modesty?" With heightened colour she said, "I don't see what else we can do." "I might sleep in the bath." "Oh, don't be so absurd, Clive. You'd be very uncomfortable. After all, it isn't like a double bed." "Just so," he drawled, "and I don't think I snore." He pushed the beds further apart. "Pity there isn't a screen." "I look quite nice in bed," she told him pertly. "Too nice," he returned. "I've seen you." "Of course, when I was your patient. You're half a doctor, so you're used to seeing women in bed." She strove to speak lightly, to break the tension which seemed to be developing. "With one exception, my patients didn't have beds, and I never slept with them." His eyes glinted wickedly. Suddenly alarmed, Angela stammered, You aren't... I mean..." He gave her a long look and laughed. "Rest easy, Angela. It's only your reputation that's in jeopardy, and we'll deal with that problem if and when it arises." I'll just say that again. "Rest easy, Angela. It's only your reputation that's in jeopardy, and we'll deal with that problem if and when it arises. Suppose you get to bed, Mrs. Stratton, and I'll take a turn outside while you undress. By the time I come back, you'll be sound asleep." She was not, but she pretended to be when he returned, so noiselessly that she only knew he was there when she saw his shadow on the wall, cast by the shaded light from the bedside lamp. He went into the bathroom and returned in only his shirt. She heard the other bed creak as he lay down upon it, and darkness descended as he switched off the light. She heard him give a deep sigh of content, and then silence. Angela could not sleep. She was overtired and overstimulated. The room was not wholly dark. Moonlight filtered through the slatted blinds, and as her eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, she could discern the various objects in the room. She turned on her side towards Clive and looked across at him. He was sleeping quietly, oblivious of her proximity, so near and yet so far, and after tomorrow she might not see him again. The next day was full of fateful possibilities. The police, or the air company, would reveal who had been on that unlucky plane, and to their list who would be her own name and that of whoever had been with her. Would she recognize it, she wondered? Would the veil lift and reveal her past? Subconsciously she had known that tragedy lay behind it. That was why she had striven not to remember, but she could not hide behind it any longer. It would be the end of her association with Clive. The British consul would arrange to send her home. Home? Did she possess one? The only place that was really home was the wooden house in Nuristan. There she had felt safe, so long as Clive was with her. Her doubts and fears began to assume nightmare proportions. She sat up in bed and stared at the sleeping Clive. She wanted to wake him. She desperately needed his voice and touch to drive her bogies away. He had never failed her yet. He was so tired. It was not fair to burden him with her apprehensions. She depended upon him too long. She was unsure of her exact feelings for him. She only knew that he would leave a void that it would be impossible to fill. For months their lives had mingled, and he had comprised her whole horizon. With no past and a nebulous future, she had clung to him as the one stable factor in her existence. She felt incapable of standing alone. The very thought caused her palms to sweat. He was still there within a few feet of her. She felt a desperate urge to creep into his arms, to feel his reassuring clasp about her. She did not recognize that it was prompted by a deeper, more primitive emotion, a woman's yearning for her mate. She slipped out of bed and crossed the space between them, and then she hesitated, recalling the glint in his eyes when he had seen her unbound hair. He might consider her action was an invitation. A reckless excitement swept over her. It did not matter if he did. If they became lovers, he would never abandon her. It was a means whereby she could bind him to her. Her excuse was her desperate need of him. He did not understand how utterly lost she would be without him, and had he not connived at such a climax? When he had signed her in as Mrs. Stratton, she knelt down beside him, bringing her face level with his. Gently she touched his head, stroking the fine golden hair. Sensing her presence, he stirred, and her heart began to race with eager anticipation. "Clive," she whispered. Sleepily he murmured, "Jasmine." Angela recoiled as if she had been bitten by a snake. Swiftly she regained her own bed and pulled the sheet over her head. Jasmine! The woman in his past, the woman who she surmised had rejected him, but for whom he still hankered. Perhaps in spite of all the bitter things he had said about her sex, the breach was not beyond healing. Even now he was dreaming of her and a possible reunion. What a rebuff she had been inviting by her mad impetuosity. For one thing emerged with painful clarity. Angela the waif would never be more to him than a tiresome burden that he was anxious to relinquish, and she had been crazy to imagine otherwise.